Hello and welcome back to the channel. Like I said last time, I want to this week go over some of the action options available to player characters in PF2 and just give a little quick overview of what they are, what they can do, and just a brief summary of my opinion of each of them. So this page I'm on lists all of the actions that anyone can do without any sort of investment. So it's a pretty good baseline to start if you want to look at third action options. It also tends to include things like crawling, like delaying your turn, dropping prone, things you don't necessarily want to be using as a standard third action in combat. And it fails to include things that require investment, things like demoralizing, things like athletics checks. Those wouldn't fall under basic actions. So what I'm going to do is I've split the actions into three different categories based roughly on how much investment I believe it takes to use the action, ranging from an action that's available to anyone or available to everyone with a small amount of gold investment, to actions which require significant player character investment to really take advantage of. Now, the first action I want to discuss is the aid action. Aid is an action you take whenever someone is about to attempt something, usually a skill check or a table. And the way it works is you spend an action on your turn to prepare to aid, and then when your actually attempts the check, you can spend a reaction to aid, making a skill check or table of the same type that your ally is making, and usually against DC 20, although your GM is allowed to adjust that DC as they see fit. Now, if you succeed on an aid, you get a +1 to +4 bonus depending on how well you succeed and your proficiency level, and if you critically fail, you get a -1. So at level 1, aid is not super great. DC 20 is hard to even hit, it's definitely not consistent, and DC 30 for that critical success is basically only going to happen on a natural 20. But as your level increases, to level 5, level 10, and especially level 20, aid is a very easy way to spend one action and one reaction to give an ally anywhere from +2 to +4 on anything that they attempt. And this can be very potent because there's a lot of skills and actions where circumstance bonuses are actually somewhat rare. Like getting a circumstance bonus on your intimidation check is not the easiest thing to do. So if you can have an ally aid you, even if you're only getting +2 or +3, because they aren't legendary in the skill, that is going to be a +2 or +3. That's very easy to get at medium to high level. It's very consistent and conflicts with very few other bonuses, which means aid is simple but a very effective way to spend a third action into reaction. The second option I want to go through is interacting activating items. Interacting is, as it sounds like, it's just interacting. Might be drawing an item, opening doors. Certain activations are actually also interact actions. For example, drinking a potion is you activating a potion by spending an interact action. And then activate is activating a magic item. Whereas might be, as stated before, drinking a potion, might be casting spells from a wand, might be activating the special properties of your magical boots. That sort of thing all fall under activate. And these two effects obviously depend a lot on what you spend your money on. For example, if you never buy a potion in your life, you're never going to interact to drink a potion. However, PF2 has a large amount of items with a wide variety of effects that might be useful to an adventurer throughout an adventuring day. Things like smoke sticks, things like potions, wands, so on and so forth. So, having a wide variety of options available to you to just, if you ever happen to need deployable smoke to pop your smoke stick, if someone happens to go down near you, you can feed them a potion, and so on and so forth, is a pretty solid use of a third action. It's probably not the most consistent use, but it's always good to have in the back of your mind. And this is to say nothing of scenarios your DM might construct where you need to fight an enemy and also do something that requires interacting. Things like opening doors to escape, things like pushing buttons on a console to make sure the bomb doesn't explode. These would also all likely be interact actions, and they would also all be options for third actions in that particular combat. The next option is raising a shield and its more environmental dependent cousin, taking cover. Both of these are one action to get a circumstance bonus to your AC. Cover also allows you to use stealth actions, which I'll cover later. And this one is just the classic old reliable. If you don't know what else to use your third action for, and you happen to have a hand you aren't using, taking a shield into battle and raising a shield to give yourself +2 to your AC until your next turn is basically never bad. The nice thing about PF2 is everyone can raise a shield innately. You don't need to be like specially trained in shields to do so. Anyone can strap a shield to their arm and hide behind it for +2 to AC. And +2 to AC is a pretty significant deal, especially because it's a circumstance bonus to AC, which is somewhat difficult to come across. A lot of spells will grant status bonuses to AC, armor obviously is an item bonus to your AC, but circumstance bonuses to AC outside of shields and cover is not super common. So being able to just always basically bump your AC by +2, effectively raising your armor proficiency by 1 level, is just a pretty solid option if you have nothing else to do. And the last option of the common easy to access ones is just basic movement, focused primarily on stepping and striding, but you might have more esoteric forms of movement. Probably the most common one for PCs is fly via the fly spell, or some magic item that allows you to fly, sometimes even class feats. You have something like swimming, climbing, burrowing. Those are all also especially useful forms of movement because not a lot of monsters will be able to chase you when you burrow into the ground. Now, stepping and striding doesn't seem like that great of a use of your third action, but because of the design of PF2, not a lot of monsters have attacks of opportunity. So, if you can walk up to a monster, hit it, and then walk away, or start your turn next to the monster, hit it twice and walk away, or even maybe hit it, trip it, and then walk away, the monster will have to spend extra actions to stand up and attack you. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a kind of a meaningless trade. You're trading one of your actions for one of the monster's actions. But in general, one of the monster's actions is quite valuable, whereas one of your actions may not necessarily be as valuable as most of the actions. This is for a couple of reasons. One, you usually have 2 to 4 friends with you, so your side of the battle might have, you know, 10 to 15 actions at your disposal, so spending one isn't that big of a deal. Whereas the monster, especially if it's a boss monster, might only have 6 actions on their side, so spending one of their actions is much more valuable than spending one of your 15. Secondly, the way monsters are designed in PF2 is a decent amount of them have pretty powerful 3-action activities or 1 and 2 action combos, where they'll spend 1 action to do something and then 2 action to combo after it. And so because monsters' third actions tend to be more valuable than PC's third actions, trading 1 for 1 in the action economy is usually going to end up in the PC's favor. To say nothing of the fact that this can combo with other ways to restrict actions, such as tripping your opponent or slowing them, which will only compound this effect. Losing 1 action on your turn is bad, but losing 2 actions on your turn is debilitating. And if you can somehow cost a monster all 3 of their actions on their turn, well, suddenly that monster isn't doing anything. It's basically skipped their turn. Now I want to move on to some of the third action options which do require a little bit of character investment, and we're going to start with athletics actions. So athletics, based off of strength, allows you to perform a variety of combat maneuvers in combat, and these are grapple, shove, trip, and disarm. And these vary in usefulness and use cases, in which DCs they target, but they're all basically an athletics check against a particular DC, either fortitude or reflex, and depending on the degree of success you attain, you either debuff your enemy or if you critically fail, usually suffer a thematic debuff of your own. For example, grapple. On a success, you grab your opponent, which makes them flat-footed and immobile. But on a crit failure, you fail, your opponent knocks you off balance, and you fall prone. Shoving allows you to move your opponent around the battlefield. Tripping allows you to knock your opponent prone, and disarming allows you to attempt to knock your opponent's weapon out of your hand. So, going through these one at a time. So grapple primarily applies flat-footed to opponent, but it's especially debilitating on spellcasters, because grabbed forces anyone who takes a manipulate action, which most spells involve some kind of manipulate action, to make a DC 5 check or lose whatever action they're trying to take. So if you grab a spellcaster and they try and cast a spell to get out, well, if they fail that DC 5 check, their actions are wasted and the spell doesn't go off. If you somehow crit success your opponent, restrained means your opponents can't take any actions except to try and escape, which basically means, especially if you have a good athletics DC, which you're probably going to if you're trying to grapple things, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of opponents to get free of your grapple to be able to actually do things in combat anymore. Next is Trip. Trip obviously knocks opponents prone, which also applies flat-footed to them. But Trip is really good if you have multiple people or even just one person with attack of opportunity. Because to recover from Trip, you have to stand up from prone, and that triggers attack of opportunity. So if you have attack of opportunity and your other friend standing next to you has attack of opportunity, if one of you can trip the opponent, not only are they flat-footed, giving both of you a better chance to hit, not only do they take a malus to any attacks against you while they're still prone, but if they ever try and stand up again, unless they take special precaution against it, they're going to trigger an attack of opportunity from both of you, making 2 mapless attacks against them as they try and stand up, which is a lot of free damage. It's basically 2 extra actions, but even better than 2 extra actions, because the 2 extra actions aren't going to contribute to your normal multiple attack penalty on your turn. Next is shove, and shove is a pretty obvious use case is where if you want to get your opponent into a different space. This one isn't as obviously useful as grapple and trip because the difference between an opponent being in one square versus opponent being in the next square over isn't always relevant, but still useful for if you want to make sure someone gets off of your spellcasters, or if there happens to be a handy cliff nearby that you can knock them out. Shove can be good in those cases to make sure that opponents stay where you want them to stay. And finally, disarm. So disarm is probably the weakest of the athletics actions. On a success, you don't actually disarm the target, they just take a -2 to attacks, but they take a -2 to attacks until the start of their next turn, where they immediately re-equip the item. So they take a -2 to like attacks of opportunity, which goes away as soon as the turn starts, so there's not even a -2 when they're actually attacking on their turn. And if you actually want to disarm them, you want to knock the item out of their hand, it requires a critical success, which is pretty difficult to get even if you're investing heavily into athletics. So disarm isn't the most common use case. However, if it does work and in the right situation, disarm can easily end encounters. If someone's holding a MacGuffin that you need to get out of their hand and you manage to disarm it, pick up the item and run away, well, problem solved. If you disarm a spellcaster's focus, which is going to be significantly easier because a spellcaster usually has a somewhat low reflex DC, then suddenly they aren't able to cast a lot of their spells, which can basically neuter their effectiveness in combat. So disarm is somewhat difficult to have a use case for. When those use cases come up, disarm can be a pretty effective attempt, at least, to as an action to use. The next option is demoralize, which keys off of intimidation. Now, if the target and you don't share a language, then you take a -4 to the check. However, there are skill feats that can get around this. And when you attempt to demoralize, even if you fail, the target is immune for 10 minutes. So basically, you can only attempt this one time per creature per combat. However, the benefit of demoralize is on a success, the target is frightened 1, and on a crit success, the target is frightened 2. Now, frightened gives a status penalty equal to the value to everything the opponent does. All of their attacks, all of their skill checks, their perception checks, their ACs, their DCs for their skill checks, and their spells all get reduced by -1 across the board. Now, this isn't going to last for the entire combat because Frighten ticks down at the end of each of your turns. So for Frighten 1, it'll last for 1 round to Frighten 0. But even just giving a creature Frighten 1 is pretty good to let all of your allies have a +1 chance on whatever they're doing against the creature, and have the creature have a -1 chance on anything they attempt against you. So while Demoralize isn't going to necessarily end encounters by itself, it can give a pretty significant but subtle boost to 1 or 2 rounds of a combat against a creature. I also want to give a quick shout out to Bon Mot, which is a level 1 skill feat which keys off your diplomacy. And you make a diplomacy check, and if you succeed, you give your opponent a penalty to perception and will saves for a minute, which basically means the entire encounter. And on a success, it's a -2, and on a critical success, it's -3. And the reason I want to shout this out is, although you can't really make a whole character build around this because it is only 1 skill feat, it is still a very effective skill feat because a lot of very powerful abilities target enemy will saves. Demoralize, which we just looked at, targets an enemy will save, and a lot of powerful control spells, dominate and fear and so on and so forth, also target enemy will saves. So if you can lead with a Bon Mot, you succeed, your enemy has a -2 to will saves, then you can intimidate, which is much less likely to succeed and even critically succeed because your previous Bon Mot, giving an extra -1 or -2 to everything your opponent does, and then hit them with a will save spell. They're going to be taking anywhere between -3 and -5 to their normal roll against that will save, which makes it significantly more likely for them to fail and even critically fail against those powerful control spells or other will targeting effects. Next thing I want to talk about is Feint, which keys off your deception check. And if you succeed on a feint, your next melee attack against that opponent is going to be flat-footed. And this one isn't the most useful if you have a melee friend, because to get flat-footed you can just flank an opponent, which means you're on opposite sides. So that's a pretty easy way to make it flat-footed for free. However, if you're something like a solo frontliner rogue, or someone else who benefits from being on the front line, and especially benefits from um, having their opponent flat-footed, but you don't have another easy way to guarantee flat-footed on an opponent, Feint can be a pretty solid option to just lead your attacks off, your turn off with, by feinting, make your target flat-footed, and then gain all of those benefits that you would otherwise normally get from being flat-footed, like the rogue sneak attack, and so on and so forth. In addition to feint, deception also keys in creative diversion, which, instead of making your opponent just flat-footed, makes you hidden to any number of creatures that you successfully divert. Now you can only do this for 1 creature per combat because they become immune for a minute, but hidden is a significantly better condition than inflicting flat-footed on your opponents. Not only are they flat-footed anyways, but hidden allows you to also hide and sneak away. So if you need to make a quick getaway, create a diversion, you'll look over there, their enemies all glance behind them, and you sneak off behind a bush or something, allows you to fairly quickly and easily get out of combat. And of course, there's also hiding and sneaking themselves, both of which are keyed off of the stealth skill. And what these allow you to do is these allow you to become hidden and remain hidden during movement. And what hidden means is not only do enemies not know your exact position, even if they somehow find you, they're going to have a 50% mischance on any attacks they make to target you. And any attacks you make against them, they are flat-footed towards. So this is good if you're a character who doesn't want to be seen and wants to stay in the back line, but it's especially good because it's one of a very few ways for ranged characters to inflict consistent flat-footed on your opponents. So if you're a ranged rogue, investing into hide and sneak, and then taking fights in advantageous conditions where there are lots of things to hide behind, is a very good way to very consistently inflict flat-footed on your opponents and keep yourself extremely safe from retaliation at the same time. And finally, I want to go over a few options which I think require rather significant investment to be able to use your third action. The first of which are minions. Most commonly, these are going to be anal companions, like something a ranger or druid might get, but you might also get these from summon spells and things of that nature. And the way most minions work is you spend one action your turn, and your minion gains two actions to spend however they wish. This can range from obvious things like moving and striking, to special abilities the minions may have, or even spellcasting, which can come up if your minion is especially a summoned creature. Or, for example, summoned Fae have some small amount of spellcasting that they can detect. And minions, while they're often weaker than a full PC, which should be pretty obvious, they're not a full PC, they're a minion, are still pretty useful in battle because they're just an extra body with hit points that can soak attacks. And doing things like providing flanking for your melee allies without you yourself needing to get into the action, uh, being annoying, dealing chip damage, using athletics actions, especially for minions that have a decent strength score, uh, are all things that minions can do that can contribute pretty significantly to a fight. And if a minion manages to trip an opponent and you have your fighter next to it with attack of opportunity, well, you suddenly just gave your fighter one extra attack on that enemy for free. So, while minions aren't going to be as powerful as a normal PC, they can still be extremely useful uh, in combat. And if nothing else, a minion can just be an extra stack of hit points on the battlefield that your opponent needs to waste actions attacking. Every action your opponent attacks a minion is one action they aren't attacking your allies. And on-level minions are usually good enough to soak up a pretty decent amount of attacks. So having your opponent waste multiple actions, possibly even multiple turns, trying to kill off a minion is multiple turns where they aren't focusing on your allies and where you can focus solely on dealing damage to them. The next is recall knowledge. I've already made a video detailing recall knowledge, which has a lot of my thoughts in it, so for more detailed analysis, you can go check that out. But to summarize, basically, in my opinion, recall knowledge is really difficult to use if you're just kind of dipping into it. But if you build a character around it, you invest heavily into recall knowledge, and you really make it work to the best of your abilities, it can become a pretty effective way to both actually acquire knowledge about your enemies, but also to gain real tangible mechanical benefits in the system that help you and your allies actually defeat those enemies beyond just the burden of knowledge. And the final third action option I want to discuss is sustain a spell and sustain an activation. Now these are basically the same thing, it's just one is for spells, one is for activated magic items. And what these are is basically certain spells and abilities will say instead of a normal duration of like 1 minute or 10 minutes or however long, it will say sustained 1 minute or sustained an hour or just sustained, in which case the default is 10 minutes. And what this means is that the spell will last until the end of your next turn, but you can spend an action on that next turn to sustain the spell and make it last until the end of the next turn. And so each turn you want the spell to last, you need to spend an action to make sure it lasts until the next turn. And these appear most commonly on summon spells, like summon Fae, summon Animal, and so on, and certain um, damage over time spells. Things like Flaming Sphere has sustained, um, things like Aqueous Orb has sustained, and so on and so forth. And what sustained allows you to do is it allows you as a spellcaster to have a very easy option for third action. Spellcasters already have access to spells, obviously, so if you spend your first turn using 2 or maybe 3 actions to cast a spell with sustain, you can then spend the rest of your turns with a 2-action normal spell, and then that third action is sustaining that spell you spent on your first turn. And so this allows you as a spellcaster to make very easy, very effective use of all 3 actions in combat without a lot of difficulty in doing so. So that's all for my overview of action options in BF2. Once again, I don't really have a specific build because there are so many third action options, and trying to be good at all of them is a fool's errand. I'm going to do is over the next few videos, I'm going to take some of the ones that interest me the most and do basically what I did with recon knowledge, which is take a deep dive, try and find as many of the ways in the system that BF2 provides to us to take advantage of that specific skill, and see how we can use those to advantage and make that specific third action option as good for us as we can actually get it. So if you stumbled onto this and you're particularly interested in a deep dive on one of the third action options, do let me know and I'll definitely spend some work, make a video on it, see what I can find. But otherwise, look forward to the videos that will be coming out about these options. And until next time, hope you have a lovely day and hope you come back to see the deep dives that I create about these skill options.